Hello again. Today we're going to be looking at plants that thrived on smoke and soot and moving from them to open spaces and woodlands. I'm going to concentrate on Alexandra and Tollcross parks, and also I'll be saying a little bit about Pollok Park. Yesterday, we saw how the 1866 Glasgow City Improvement Act was part of a historic battle to bring healthful air and clean water to Glasgow's overcrowded citizens, empowering the city's improvement trustees to create a park for the east end of the city that would then be known as Alexandra Park, opened in 1870. So I will share my screen and we can pick up and see some images of this. There's my little introductory slide. Here now is Alexandra Park, and I'll make that full screen. There we are. Then and now. It is a wonderful green space, as I say, in the east of the city. I also talked in the last two talks a little bit about the wider move to create green spaces that had been launched with Kelvin Grove Park in the west and Queen's Park in the south. So by the 1890s, we really have this spread across the city of parks in every quarter, as it were. This was aided, not least, by a Parks Act in 1878 that enabled the city to accept gardens gifted by an individual. And so it came about, for example, that Mrs. Isabella Elder, the wife of the great Glasgow marine engineer and shipbuilder John Elder, whom you see in the statue at the bottom right here, gave to the city the famous Elder Park at Govan, opened in 1885. And by the end of the 19th century, there were really a huge number of places that were green. No less than 1,000 acres of public park space had been created in the city or acquired for use by the city. And that area was in turn expanded dramatically, of course, when Rooken Glen and Pollok Park were gifted in the 20th century. Today, then, I'm going to look in a bit more detail at both Alexandra Park, the first East End park, opened in 1870, and Tollcross Park, also in the east, but a little further to the south, opened in 1897. And I'm also going to say just a little about Pollok Park, since land towards that was first given in 1911 to the city by Sir John Stirling Maxwell, who owned the Pollok estate. I'm going to focus on these parks, not least from the point of view of the great horticultural movement that I've mentioned in my earlier talks, the huge enrichment and expansion of garden making that developed in the 19th century as new plants from overseas, the advent of greenhouses, the development of hybridization, and other techniques of cultivation became available. For this movement, in its heyday, really was coincident with the Glasgow parks. It reached its heyday in the second half of the 19th century at the time of Alexandra and Tollcross parks being opened as green lungs, places for air. Gardeners now had an unprecedented diversity of trees, flowers, and shrubs at their disposal through the exploits earlier in the century of plant hunters like the Scot David Douglas, who had brought the Douglas fir, the Californian poppy, and other species to Britain from America already in the early 19th century, as I say, and also through the discoveries of botanists like Sir William Jackson Hooker, our own professor of botany at the University of Glasgow and then director of Kew Gardens in London, who with his son Joseph Hooker had promoted the introduction and research of rhododendrons from India and Asia. And as we'll see, Tollcross Park had a rhododendron glen, indeed still has, and so does Pollok Park have a rhododendron walk laid out in the early 20th century by Sir John Stirling Maxwell, who collected and indeed bred rhododendrons. In addition, there was the enterprise of nurserymen like McCaslin of Glasgow and of industrialists like John Kibble, who gave the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow its magnificent glass palace that you see on screen here in 1873, a home both to plants and to art, because sculptures were introduced into it as a complement to the wonderful shrubs, palms and ferns. The example of Kibble Palace was almost certainly one of the factors that encouraged Baillie A.G. MacDonald, a former convener of the city's Parks Committee, to donate his own private glass house and its contents to Tollcross Park in 1898. The structure was transplanted, iron support by iron support and pane of glass by pane of glass, from his garden at Ardrossan to its focal position at the heart of Tollcross Park, as a telling and touching act of tribute to the district in which, he explained, he'd spent his boyhood. We can view this cynically as an effort to compensate, at least in part, for industry's spoliation of nature. We might see it as a display of power, showcasing plants obtained from different places, or at perhaps a more complex psychological level, we can see MacDonald's gift as a reminder of the distinctive nature of gardens that I discussed in the second talk as in-between or border zones that mediate between city and country, and as such, according to today's neuroscientists, evoke deeper emotional responses than sites that are straightforwardly here or there. As a reminder of Baillie MacDonald's Tollcross boyhood, the glasshouse would at the least have made the park in turn for him what ethnographers and anthropologists today call an attachment environment, a place with special emotional significance for the people who use and cherish it. We'll be thinking today about the garden as an attachment environment in several other ways as well, as it's an idea clearly also at work in the many other activities for which Alexandra and Tollcross Parks provide opportunity, and provided already from their creation in the late 19th century. Also, Pollok Park too provides other activities, not just the horticultural, as well as places for admiring flowers. After all, they're places where you can go for a stroll, and indeed the 19th century ancestors, in the case of Tollcross and Alexandra, of our amusement parks and sports centres. Those two parks had hugely popular bandstands and stages for music and theatre. And then there was Alexandra Park's 170-foot swimming pool made from a former quarry, tastefully shaded by alders and willows, and used by 1878 by no less than 59,947 people over 5 months, each paying a penny. In addition, there were golf, bowling, skating, amongst other recreations in both Tollcross and Alexandra Parks. Activities, in other words, that involved an active bodily engagement with the air or water that Professor Gairdner, the Chief Medical Officer of Glasgow, and in turn the City Improvement Trustees, had so prized in the mid-19th century at the origin of the Glasgow Parks, as the free right of all citizens and the means to health and moral as well as physical strength. James Whitton, who became superintendent of public parks in Glasgow in 1893, was particularly keen to enhance these recreational aspects of the Glasgow parks. And that is why he visited Germany, Holland, and Belgium in 1895 to see how their public parks provided for recreation. But rather interestingly, he concluded that Glasgow was already superior in this recreation aspect. Where Germany did excel, as I mentioned yesterday, he felt was in creating landscape parks that provided what he called a quiet, calm retreat from the heat and noise of the streets, a dreamy, poetic calm. So, well, we'll see how by the end of the century in Glasgow, there is indeed also an emphasis on natural effects, and these very much come to the fore at Rooken Glen and at Pollok in the 20th century. But first, I want, as I say, to look at how Alexandra and Tollcross parks fit into this great horticultural movement that I've mentioned before. As you know, I'm an art historian, and here I suppose I declare my own attachment. Art and horticulture, after all, come together in some intriguing and evocative ways in the great horticultural movement and the parks then that benefited from it. If they show a new emphasis on active recreation, then plants, flowers and trees in the Glasgow parks were no less important. And if we don't, amidst the crowds splashing in the pool at Alexandra or listening to brass bands at Tollcross, find exactly a German-style, dreamy, poetic calm, then something like the rhododendron glen at Tollcross that you see here would certainly have been a highly evocative and immersive space, and similarly for the rhododendron walk at Pollok, as we'll see. So then, the ferment of activity in the 19th century to seek out new plants from far places and to breed ever bigger, more colourful or striking varieties of plants and flowers meant that by the time period of our two East End parks, Alexandra and Tollcross, horticulturalists themselves, as I mentioned in my very first talk, were routinely described as artists. Not just the layout of gardens, traditionally seen as an art, but the very plants within them were now seen as something akin to a work of art, being nature manipulated by human hand, whether through the new science of hybridization or by grafting, a key technique in cultivating rhododendrons across Europe, in fact, by this period, or simply by bringing plants on early in vast hothouses for bedding out, so that there was uninterrupted spring to autumn colour, as in Haussmann's parks in Paris. And here's just a reminder of those, a couple of the flowers that Haussmann had grown in his wonderful glass houses, and bringing on gardens at La Muette in Paris, the Pelargonium zonale and the Petunia. Alexandra Park, we can see in period photographs, full of beds with plants bedded out, but to dig a bit more deeply into the balance of art and nature, horticulture and wilderness, and equally more mere looking and more engaged sensory and even physical immersion that we find emerging at Alexandra and Tollcross parks, I think we need first to recall that the east of Glasgow, where they were built, was hardly a promising place to make a modern park in the 19th century. We only need to read the Glasgow Herald's account of the ceremony on the 8th of September, I should say, 1870, at which Alexandra Park was opened to the public, to get an ominous portent of difficulties ahead. So here's what the Herald reports. Yesterday afternoon, the new park in the northeast quarter of the city, which has been styled the Alexandra Park, was officially opened by the Lord Provost Magistrates and Town Council. It extends in all to about 100 acres. The view from the summit is one of the finest to be had in the neighbourhood of Glasgow, comprising as it does to the east a magnificent panorama of the valley of the Clyde, and to the northwest the bold ranges of the Kilpatrick and Campsie Hills, with in the distance the towering height of Ben Lomond. There was a considerable assemblage of spectators. The weather, too, was very favourable for any outdoor celebration, the day being one of the brightest and warmest we have had for some time. So far, so good. But now, reading on in the report, comes the rub. Unfortunately, the wind blew from the northwest, bringing with it a good deal of the smoke which is emitted from certain public works in that direction. In this respect, the park was yesterday seen at its worst, but notwithstanding this disadvantage, the pleasant slopes and trim parterres were fresh and fragrant. Well, this is a decidedly circumspect account. For even as the city's bigwigs were opening Alexandra Park in September 1870, a celebrated nuisance case, as it was called, was being prepared by the sanitary inspector for the barony parish in which it stood under the 1867 Public Health Act for Scotland, and this case was against Messrs. Binning and Sons, paraffin oil and coal tar distillers of the Blochern Chemical Works adjacent to the park. So one of those chimney conglomerations that we see in the distance there would have been Binning's. Exactly a month later, this case came before the Sheriff Court with a battery of witnesses who related how in late August and early September, just the time of the opening of the park, in other words, they had experienced what they called a heavy, disgusting, nasty and choking smell, remaining long in the nostrils, producing nausea and sickness, or a choky feeling in the throat and lungs, stifling and suffocating. A sensation of sickness and inclination to vomit. I won't go on except to say that the court heard how the effects were, quote, of so unbearable a character that they drove visitors away from Alexandra Park. And various doctors then testified that the nuisance was injurious to health. Well, since these problems had been going on for some time, though they reached a peak around August, September 1870, one wonders how on earth the, quote, hundreds of starving operatives and labourers who were employed to make the park had ever survived the experience. These were the handloom workers who had been made unemployed by the depression of the late 1860s and the mechanisation of their trade. Anyway, the case was won by the sanitary inspector and binnies were required to clean up, though to judge by this 1894 photograph, they were only part of the problem. Here we have not so much a park that's an attachment environment for its users, an emotionally engaging, personally meaningful space with which they identify, as an environment that attaches itself to those within it, filling their lungs not with the clean air desired by the city improvement trustees, but instead with particles of soot and fumes from noxious chemicals. If the artist James McNeill Whistler made a virtue of smog in his paintings of London at this period, those in charge of planting the Alexandra Park certainly had a problem on their hands, at least initially. Duncan McClellan, the city park's superintendent at the time, noticed that in the park, as a rule, evergreen shrubs do not seem able to withstand the winter and smoke, with the exception of broad-leaved hollies, rhododendrons, and aucubas. And these are some of the plants then that he was finding were coping. He also recorded that, quote, many of the deciduous trees have done very well, and it is quite surprising to find how fresh and green the foliage continues during the greater part of the summer. Flowers have also succeeded remarkably well. He's writing a few years after the opening of the park, and they attain a considerable degree of perfection. About 60,000 plants and bulbs are annually bedded out, and in a good season, there is quite a brilliant display of colour during the summer and autumn months. Well then, how did this come about, this horticultural success that seems to defy the odds? As we've seen, the Glasgow Herald is already referring to fresh and fragrant flower beds on the day of opening in 1870, despite the horrible pollution. Well, given that the land on which Alexandra Park was made was described as barren and treeless at its beginnings, it's almost certain that the attractive appearance that the press recorded in 1870 when it was opened was due not least to trees having been transplanted there wholesale, not grown from seed, but dug up from the countryside and installed ready grown like elements of a stage set. This was the technique in use in the Paris parks that the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Gairdner, and his City Council colleagues had visited in 1866, And it was indeed a Scot, William McNab, and his younger colleague, William Barron, who, working at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh in the early 19th century, had developed one of the most widely used tree transplanting machines that you see here on the screen, that may even have been some of the equipment deployed in the Paris parks, an intriguing quirk of history. Equally, the flower garden part of Alexandra Park is recorded in Maclellan's Parks report for 1882 as being by then, quote, situated in a hollow where it was less susceptible to the smoke. And in May and June of 1884, it's reported in his records that it alone had 44,000 plants bedded out, including violas and calceolarias, with flower vases, as they were termed, stone urns and similar containers planted with flowers, being especially successful. Well, violas are wonderful scented flowers. It's a little close-up of some growing today. And calceolarias, as you can see on the right-hand slide, are especially brash, colourful flowers. Originally from South America, they'd been brought back to Europe, some of them anyway, by Charles Darwin. The French certainly grew them in the floral garden of the Bois de Boulogne, for example. They like acidic soil, so I imagine that might have perhaps helped at Alexandra Park, though I think David Mitchell, the botanist, will be the person to ask about that in our discussion that will follow this, the interview that accompanies these talks. Anyway, both violas and calceolarias, like other bedding flowers, would almost certainly have been discarded at the end of each summer, and a fresh start made with new plants the following year. And we know that at the end of the season, local citizens were allowed to take home bedding plants from the parks to grow on themselves as window box flowers, or even indoors to keep them going through the winter. So there were ways and means of getting around the smoke simply by having a good turnover of your plants so that you didn't encounter difficulties long term. Choosing the right flowers made a big difference. And although conifers are reported as coming to grief at Alexandra Park, there's apparently lots of success with deciduous trees, as we heard a minute ago in that quote from the Superintendent of Parks report. Again, like flowers grown annually, deciduous trees, of course, make a fresh start each year because they lose their leaves in the autumn, unlike the conifers that you see here. And in the cleaner west of the city, we find conifers growing happily. They were a feature of Elder Park, for example, but not at Alexandra Park. Numerous varieties of firs, pines, and other conifers have been introduced from North America in the 19th century, not least the Douglas fir, discovered by David Douglas from Scone near Perth. They offered a very wide range of greens and yellows, and they could be pruned into artful shapes, whilst the dark green varieties provided an excellent background to set off colourful flowers. So these aesthetic properties, if you like, had made them a mainstay in Victorian gardens, and they were notably promoted by William Barron, the tree transplanter whom I mentioned with the special machinery. But as the modern garden historians Eliot, Watkins and Daniels have suggested, evergreens, as are conifers in general, are trees that have symbolism too. And I'd like to quote you a little comment that Eliot, Watkins and Daniels have made about this. They say, like swelling Victorian cities, evergreens defied time and the passage of the seasons. Like growing industrial economies, they were not idle for large parts of the year, but always showing their productivity and beauty. So it's easy to see why Maclellan, the park superintendent, would have felt such trees appropriate for a park in a district of distinctive and productive factory and industrial enterprise. The trees themselves, the conifers, would have been the ideal symbolic trees to grow in Alexandra Park. And it really must have been quite a blow for the city fathers when the conifers fell foul of the smoke and soot over in the east in Alexandra Park. But all was not lost, as we've seen, and some evergreens, the hollies, the aucubas, rhododendrons, are recorded in the council's parks reports of the period as doing really quite well in Alexandra Park. Aucubas that you see on the screen here, and rhododendrons too, were newly introduced plants, veritable stars of the 19th century's great horticultural movement. And by 1852, aucubas were being described in the horticultural press as, quote, one of our best hardy evergreen shrubs that succeeds better than most other evergreens in squares and gardens in the vicinity of towns. So you can see why from the slide on screen. They have these lovely, thick, shiny leaves in this example from Tollcross Park today. You can see those reflecting the light, and polluted rainwater, of course, drips off that thick, shiny leaf. Further, it was only the year before Alexandra Park was begun, 1865, it was begun in 1866, opened in 1870, it was only the year before it was begun, 1865, that saw the Scottish plant collector Robert Fortune locate in Japan and bring back to Britain the male form of aucuba that is essential to obtaining its very decorative bright red berries that you see there in the left slide. Together with the variegated foliage of many aucubas, also visible in these slides here, this makes them a particularly decorative as well as robust plant for cities. So horticultural, again, as art. Rhododendrons that were introduced from India and China in the 19th century have magnificent and often strongly coloured and scented flowers, so they would have added further colour, and their cultivation and further breeding and crossbreeding in Britain had been significantly promoted by Sir William Jackson Hooker, whom I mentioned earlier, the Regius Chair of Botany at Glasgow University and then Director at Kew Gardens in London, who sent his son and successor at Kew, Joseph Hooker, to explore for them in the Himalayas, and that led to the famed rhododendron dell at Kew. Sir John Sterling Maxwell is part of this great rhododendron movement in the late 19th century. The rhododendron walk that he developed at Pollok Park was the result of his own rhododendron collecting in the Himalayas. And though he found pollution still something of a problem even in Pollok, and therefore grew some of his mature specimens on his remote estate at Karur in the wildness of the West Highlands, the walk did succeed in Pollok, and we enjoy it still today. Indeed, aucubas and rhododendrons, both of them, grow into large spreading plants. They're not neat and tidy. They bring a note of the wild, the untamed, as well as the exotic into a park or garden. Meanwhile, in the nuisance case of 1870 against the Blochern Chemical Works near Alexandra Park, hydrogen sulfide, a byproduct of oil refining, was identified as the horrible pollutant that was making the local people feel ill, though it was clearly at a low enough concentration not actually to kill them. As such, however, we may ask if it was precisely what made the violas, calceolaria, aucubas, rhododendrons, deciduous trees do rather well. Modern science in our own times has discovered that hydrogen sulfide in lowish quantities acts as a powerful plant fertilizer. And McClellan, the city park's superintendent in Glasgow, certainly noted that some pollution actually seemed to do his plants good. And in 1870, Thomas Anderson, the Regius Chair of Chemistry at the University of Glasgow, had demonstrated that the Glasgow sewage collected for agricultural use, on the model of what went on in Paris too, was particularly effective when taken from industrial areas of the city, as it contained higher amounts of ammonia, a substance good for plant growth. All in all, then, things were perhaps not quite as bad as one might fear from the reports of the terrible nuisance case at Alexandra Park of 1870. Court actions like that taken against Binney's chemical works there must have had some effect. And in essence, we have that Victorian concern to mitigate pollution at Alexandra Park as something in which we can perhaps actually recognize the beginnings of today's environmental consciousness, the path to COP26. As I mentioned in my very first talk, Sir John Sterling Maxwell, who left Pollok Park to the city in the 20th century, was writing already in 1917 on the ways that planting trees could alter climate. Pollok Park was actually where he experimented himself with many different kinds of coniferous and deciduous trees, and he was instrumental in turn in the foundation of the Forestry Commission in 1919, as well as being a founder of the National Trust. Meanwhile, I'd like to suggest that the pollution issue, by giving aucubas, rhododendrons and the like a star role, actually gave momentum to the trend for natural effects in Glasgow that would, from the 1880s, be promoted by the horticulturalist William Robinson. In his influential book, The Wild Garden, Robinson had argued for plants to be grown in a natural way, rather than being stiffly organized in endless geometric beds. Especially on the edges of gardens and parks, they might take the eye naturally into the wider countryside. Robinson, who was Irish but came and worked in Britain, in London and one or two other places in the second half of the 19th century, Robinson liked rhododendrons for this reason, because they were large, rambling shrubs, and he was responsible for spreading the late 19th century taste for herbaceous borders, where plants grow together in profusion, interweaving with one another. I think I mentioned that in talk number 2. So edges, borders again. It's that freer, looser style, that element of letting natural styles of growth in, that must therefore clearly have already begun to emerge in the East End parks, simply because smoke and soot were making rhododendrons and aucubas a better spec than stiff conifers. And it's also what Sterling Maxwell created with many of the tree plantings at Pollok, as if bringing something of his own private estate at Curur into the space. In Alexandra Park, fairly near the entrance, we thus find an irregularly shaped natural model both pond for children, plus a wildfowl pond bordered by bulrushes, where an array of ducks and swans already had their homes on opening day in 1870. We know that because the Herald tells us of a joyous duck hunt that took place on that opening day. So here are these aspects of the wild entering the Glasgow parks. We've got them emerging in Sir John Sterling Maxwell's plantings and so on at his own private park that then becomes a city park in the 20th century, Pollok Park, but we already have them in the way that natural styles of growth are entering the parks in Alexandra and Tollcross. In Alexandra Park, indeed, as we climb the hill there, we have a gently winding path. You see the beginning of it in the right-hand side here, that takes us up beyond the formal flower beds to the golf course, again, part of the original layout, and beyond that to an almost forest-like area of natural growth. And with the various deciduous trees that did well in polluted environments, plus not least the rhododendrons and aucuba, there would have been really quite a dose of nature, as it were, in Alexandra Park. Over to the northwest, then, from the park are fine views of the countryside, still just to be had today beyond the M8, and we can, on a good day, see over to Ben Lomond. Here's that transition, in other words, from city to countryside. The park as a boundary space, the kind of space that today, as we've seen, neuroscientists tell us sets our border cells firing, priming our emotions. We can perhaps begin to understand the eloquence of the Glasgow Herald at Alexandra Park's opening, when it spoke of the magnificent panorama, the admirable situation, and so on. And by the time we get to Tollcross Park, opened in 1897 and made from the former 19th century private estate of Tollcross House, we have, as I've mentioned, a full-blown rhododendron glen, a Scottish variant, if you like, of the Kew rhododendron dell, albeit on a smaller scale. This glen at Tollcross was developed around an existing burn that already ran through part of the grounds of Tollcross House there. And not only rhododendrons, but also aucuba and bamboo. You can just see some of the bamboo there still growing today. They were added, giving a sort of exotic note, but also lending variety to the colours, the textures of this space. It became a kind of Oriental come Scottish paradise. Still today, as I say, you can find those plants still flourishing. Equally, we have an avenue of ancient deciduous trees. You see part of it here on the right, that was left intact from the time of Tollcross House, the mid-19th century residence of the Dunlop family who gave the land that is now Tollcross Park to the city. And these trees still make this part of the park an almost rural landscape, balancing the more formal area of parterres and small walks next to Tollcross House. This more formal area next to the house, with its intersecting paths, bandstand and flower beds, is now partly given over to the Great Rose Garden, one of the national rose trial gardens, where new varieties of roses are tested. But you can still get a sense, I think, if you visit today, of how it would originally have led by degrees to the wilder, further edges of the park, the part where today we find Tollcross Leisure Centre, but when originally developed, you might have found a deer. Here's a period postcard reminding us of that. As at Alexandra Park, in fact, deer were originally placed in these wilder, partly wooded areas, and we might think of these parks, these further reaches of both Tollcross and Alexandra Park, as a kind of Glasgow Bois de Boulogne, updated not so much with Houseman's ideals, but with the new wild aesthetic of William Robinson. And of course, what had been learnt about outwitting pollution, growing deciduous trees, growing aucubas and so on. Meanwhile, the flowers in the tidy bit near the front of the park, near the entranceway, near Tollcross House, would have benefited from the ammonia-rich sewage that I've mentioned from local industries that was used in creating fertilizer and other agricultural products. At the centre of the more formal part of Tollcross Park, as I've mentioned, was placed then in 1898 the winter gardens that were given by Baillie MacDonald. And in our first talk, we heard how he had them transplanted, so to speak, pane of glass by pane of glass from his own private estate at Ardrossan. And whilst Tollcross Park didn't have a swimming pool like Alexandra Park, the very intensity of the encounter with the exotic plant world, palms, orchids, ferns, that the hothouse would originally have offered, is, of course, another reminder of that sensory abundance of the late Victorian park, a kind of interior version of the abundance to be found in the wild rhododendron glen with its wonderful flowers. So the power of the park as an attachment environment that engages us emotionally is very much to the fore, I think, in these spaces. It's a place where you can immerse yourself in nature, whether inside a hothouse, in an outdoor swimming pool made from a quarry, in a rhododendron walk or glen, or even simply by playing golf on the hilltop at Alexandra Park. It's a place where you have an experience for the whole body, a new kind of full-on encounter with nature that powerfully compels the senses and thereby intensifies the emotion of the park environment as a boundary space that mediates between the city and wider countryside. If horticulture is a form of art, then here is a forerunner, surely, of the immersive art of our own day, like the installations by Olaf Eliasson at Tate Modern and other types of what is known as immersive art, where the viewer walks through the artwork. Pissarro, already in the 19th century, the French Impressionist painter, certainly said that he found himself plunging into painting his Rhododendron Glen series at Kew Gardens when he went and painted in London in the 1890s. It's as if he's remembering some jump into the depths of a pool or the sea. He was clearly excited by the Rhododendron Garden's sheer sensory abundance of scent, colour, scale. And this aesthetic of almost bodily engagement with the wild garden aesthetic that was coming into parks and gardens by the late 19th century is, I think, precisely what the visitor to Tollcross Park would have experienced in its Rhododendron Glen. And similarly, at Victoria Park, in the Shipyard district of Whiteinch in Glasgow. This was opened to the public in 1888. It too was planted with a rhododendron area, not around a burn this time, as in the glen at Tollcross, but rather to complement the remarkable fossil grove, evidence of ancient trees from the earliest era of Scotland that had been discovered in course of making the new Victoria Park. Time as well as place are emotive here. Such spaces of encounter with the sensory abundance and profusion of nature, the colour, the scent, the scale of the massive rhododendrons and their forebears, the fossil grove at Victoria, the wildlife ponds, and Victoria Park has one of those too, and the deer park and soaring trees at Tollcross, followed in turn by the plantings at Pollok, can all be seen, I think, as the logical development of that quest for free, healthful air and water that had driven the original vision of Sir William Tennant Gairdner and his city improvement colleagues when they launched the movement for public parks in Glasgow. It's something, I suggest, in which Glasgow made a distinctive and significant contribution. The acquisition by the city of Rjukan Glen in the south of the city and Pollok Park in turn in the 20th century, now the home of the Burrell Collection Gallery that will be opening again before long, were the ultimate development of this ethos of rus in urbe, nature in the city. Art, health and horticulture then were brought together by the Victorians in Alexandra and Tollcross Parks and in Pollok Park in ways that were subtle, complex and richly imaginative. The wild elements in these parks speak of the same attraction to the natural landscape that drove Glasgow's famous painters of the era, the Glasgow Boys, whom we saw in first talk. Alexandra, Tollcross and Pollok Parks, like Victoria Park, are today deeply loved by the local people, and there's a similar loyalty to the many other Glasgow public parks. All Glasgow's historic parks deserve, in my view, our deepest respect and most valiant efforts to ensure that future generations can continue to enjoy and understand them. How wonderful it would be to see Kelvin Grove's herbaceous borders restored to full glory, or the Springburn Winter Palace and the Tollcross and Queen's Park glasshouses in full original function again as emblems of Glasgow's great engineering legacy. And I know there are some moves already underway to try to achieve that. But they are also, of course, not least, emblems of Glasgow's great history of art, health and horticulture, as I hope I've shown in these talks. We must make the most of the outdoor and indoor spaces of these parks in seeking to promote sustainable communities. And in the interview that follows these three talks that I have done with David Mitchell, the botanist, we'll discuss the trees and flowers that grew in these spaces in the 19th century and also look in a little more detail at their glasshouses. David is a real expert, chairman of Scotland's Garden Scheme, amongst other things, and a judge for the last 20 years of the Tollcross Rose trials that I illustrated in the slide a minute ago. So I know that my interview with him will be a truly fascinating experience, and I hope you'll tune in, as it were, look it up and enjoy it also. So thank you very much for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen and say goodbye. And I hope you'll enjoy visiting the Glasgow parks for yourselves, perhaps with a little more knowledge or at least inspiration to look at them with eyes that recreate something of what they would have been when they originally opened. Thank you.